They told us the cities were the death traps. The broadcasts, before they went silent, screamed at everyone to head for the hills, to find high ground, to isolate. They said the Appalachian spine was the safest place left in America. They lied. The cavalry isn't coming to save us because the cavalry died 3 months ago in a reinforced concrete tomb buried 600 feet beneath the Blue Ridge Mountains. I know this because I'm standing in their grave. I've been tracking a herd migration for 3 days, keeping my distance, staying downwind. I'm carrying 60 pounds of gear, level 4 plates in a tan carrier, a suppressed 18 Malawa in Quachas, 3 days of rations, and enough 5.56 ammo to start a small war or end my own life comfortably. The forest floor here is thick with pine needles, damp and silent. Too silent. In the apocalypse, silence isn't peace, it's a predator holding its breath. I stumbled upon the perimeter fence by accident. It wasn't on any topographical map, and it certainly wasn't on the civilian GPS networks before the satellites deorbited. It was 12 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, woven with black privacy slats that had grown brittle and cracked over time. The signs were faded, stripped by the wind and rain, but the bold red lettering was unmistakable. U.S. government property. No trespassing. Use of deadly force authorized. Below that, a smaller, more terrifying placard, CDC quarantine zone for biohazard level 4. The gate was chained, but the heavy padlock had been melted by what looked like thermite. Someone had breached this place, or tried to break out. I checked the chamber of my rifle, feeling that cold, familiar slide of brass, and pushed the gate open. It groaned, a sound that echoed like a dinner bell through the valley. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing but the wind. I moved in, low and fast, sweeping the fatal funnel of the entrance. The facility wasn't a building, it was a maw carved into the granite of the mountain. Massive blast doors, the kind meant to withstand a nuclear airburst, stood slightly ajar, just enough for a man to slip through. The air coming out of that crack smelled of ozone, stagnant water, and something sweet, like copper and spoiled meat. I adjusted my night vision, the green phosphor wash turning the world into a grainy surrealist nightmare, and stepped inside. The entry corridor was a kill box. Concrete walls, floor drains, and automated turret mounts hanging from the ceiling. The turrets were lifeless, pointing at the floor, their ammo belts dry. But the floor. The floor was a carpet of brass casings and black tactical gear. Dozens of bodies. Not civilians. These were operators. High-speed guys. They were piled up against the inner airlock door, their armor shredded. I knelt beside one, checking his patches. No names. Just a black Velcro square and a unit designation I didn't recognize. His face was gone, not eaten, but obliterated by blunt force. Whatever killed these men didn't do it with bullets. I pushed deeper. The silence in the bunker was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat and the soft crunch of broken glass under my boots. I found the central command desk in what looked like a triage center. Papers were scattered everywhere, medical charts, evacuation orders, and one file stamped with a crimson ink that looked wet in the gloom. Protocol black. I picked it up. My gloves were shaking. It wasn't an evacuation plan. It was a containment protocol. The orders were simple. Upon breach of containment, seal all exits. Initiate purge. No survivors. They didn't build this place to cure the virus. They built it to weaponize it. And then I heard it. A wet, guttural clicking sound coming from the ventilation shaft above my head. It wasn't the shuffling of the mindless dead I'd killed on the highway. This was rhythmic. Intelligent. I raised my rifle, the suppressor heavy on the end of the barrel, and clicked my weapon light on. The beam cut through the dust motes, and hit the vent grate just as it exploded outward. Something fell to the floor with a wet slap. A man, or what used to be a man, wearing a shredded lab coat. His skin was translucent, veins pulsing with black fluid, his jaw unhinged. He didn't groan. He hissed. And then, from the darkness of the corridor behind him, a dozen more pairs of eyes reflected the light of my torch. I flicked the safety off. Welcome to Ground Zero. The first shot didn't drop him. That was the first lesson in the new curriculum of survival within the mountain. In the world above, a 5.56 round to the thoracic cavity puts a man down, or at least staggers him long enough to deliver the mercy shot. But the thing in the shredded lab coat didn't stagger. It absorbed the kinetic energy like a sponge soaking up water, its translucent skin rippling around the impact point. It didn't scream either. It just pivoted, moving with a fluid, insected grace that defied human physiology, and launched itself off the ventilation grate. I dropped to my back, the concrete biting into my spine through the plate carrier, and let gravity do the work of aiming. I squeezed the trigger, riding the recoil, double tap, controlled pair, failure drill. 2 to the chest, 1 to the ocular cavity. The suppressor coughed, a dry, rhythmic thumping that sounded obscenely loud in the confined acoustics of the corridor. The creature's head snapped back, a spray of viscous, obsidian fluid painting the sterile white walls, and it collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs just inches from my boots. But the silence didn't return. The darkness behind the vent was alive. The hissing grew louder, a chorus of wet, pressurized gas escaping from a dozen pairs of lungs that no longer needed oxygen. I scrambled up, my boots slipping on the black gore, and keyed the radio on my shoulder, purely out of habit. Static. Just the white noise of the Earth's magnetic field screaming at me. There was no one on the other end. I moved. I didn't run. Running in an unknown environment is a good way to trip a claymore or break an ankle, but I moved with aggressive purpose. Sweeping the muzzle of the 18 Malawin Quatches across the shadows. The entry corridor opened up into a decontamination atrium, a vast circular chamber dominated by airlocks and chemical showers. This was the bottleneck. The choke point. And it was here that the might of the United States military had made its last, desperate stand. The devastation was total. A Humvee with a mounted .50 caliber machine gun sat in the center of the room, its tires melted into the floor, the barrel of the Ma Deuce warped from sustained fire. Spent brass carpeted the floor so thickly it was like walking on gravel. But it was the bodies that told the story. These weren't the clean, tactical corpses I'd seen at the entrance. These men had been torn apart. Power armor, the experimental exoskeletons we'd heard rumors about in the mess halls back in Bragg, lay in ruin. Servos shattered, hydraulic lines severed, operators ripped out of their metal shells like crab meat. I knelt by a fallen soldier, his helmet visor shattered. The patch on his shoulder was a black dagger on a red field, Special Activities Division. The best of the best. And they had lost. I checked his rig. His magazines were empty. His sidearm was locked back. He had fought until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. I scavenged what I could, a pristine combat knife, a sealed IFAK, and miracle of miracles, a half-charged lithium battery for my night vision. My own was flickering, the green phosphor grain getting heavier by the minute. As I swapped the battery, the hum of the facility changed. The air circulation systems, dormant or running on low power, suddenly groaned. A metallic clanking echoed through the ductwork, vibrating the floorboards. They were moving. The things in the vents. They were flanking. I pushed through the secondary blast doors, forcing the hydraulics with a crowbar I found near the Humvee. The screech of metal on metal set my teeth on edge, but I squeezed through into the hallway beyond. This was Sector 2, Research and Containment. The atmosphere here was different. The air was colder, heavier. My rebreather clicked, the filter warning light blinking amber. The air quality was degrading. The smell of ozone was replaced by something chemical, formaldehyde and rot. The walls were lined with observation windows looking into sealed clean rooms. I swept my light across the glass. Inside, the horrors of Protocol Black were preserved in amber stasis. I saw rows of gurneys, restraints snap like twigs. I saw whiteboards covered in frantic scrawl, formulas, genetic sequences, and repeated iterations of the phrase subject rejects neural dampeners. I found a terminal that still had power in a nurse's station. The screen was cracked, but the amber text was legible. I wiped the dust away with a gloved thumb. It was a status report dated 3 months ago, 2 days after the cities fell. Subject 84 Alpha exhibits enhanced predatory response. Photosensitivity confirmed. Pack coordination confirmed. The inhibitor chip failed at 0400 hours. We are initiating Protocol Black. Purge the ventilation. Seal the elevator shafts. God forgive us, we tried to build a soldier who couldn't die, and we built a monster that won't stop. A soldier who couldn't die. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't a quarantine zone for civilians. This was a bioweapons facility. The virus out there, the shamblers eating the world? That was the accident. That was the spill. What was in here? This was the product. A shadow detached itself from the ceiling 20 yards down the hall. It didn't drop, it crawled down the wall, inverted, its fingers digging into the drywall. It was larger than the first one. It wore the tattered remnants of heavy combat gear, level 4 plates fused to its chest. A ballistic helmet hanging loosely from a neck that had elongated and thickened with ropey muscle. A mutated operator. A soldier who refused to die. It turned its head, the night vision goggles on its helmet glowing with a faint, dying red light. It saw me. It didn't hiss. It growled, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated in my chest cavity. I raised the rifle, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I checked my magazine. 20 rounds left. Maybe 22. Against a creature wearing body armor. Come on, I whispered, the sound deadened by my mask. Come and get it. The creature shrieked, a sound of tearing metal, and sprinted. Not a shuffle. A sprint. It closed the distance in seconds, moving on all fours like a silverback gorilla. I fired. Controlled bursts. I aimed for the legs, the pelvis, anything not covered by the ceramic plates it still wore. The rounds sparked off the armor, but one found the meat of its thigh. It stumbled, rolling with the momentum, and crashed into a crash cart, sending medical instruments clattering across the floor. I didn't wait to see if it stood up. I ran. I sprinted past the research labs, looking for a stairwell, an elevator, a hole in the ground, anything that led away from the hunter. I saw a heavy steel door marked Armory and slammed my shoulder into it. Locked. Magnetic seal. The creature was up. I could hear the wet slap of its hands on the linoleum. It was gaining. I pulled the frag grenade from my belt, the one I'd been saving for myself. I didn't pull the pin. Not yet. I looked around desperately. To my left, a janitorial closet. To my right, a broken window leading into an office. I chose the office. I vaulted through the shattered glass, cutting my tack pants on the shards, and rolled behind a heavy oak desk just as the creature flew past the window, its momentum carrying it down the hall. I held my breath. The air in the room was stale, thick with dust. I could hear the creature skidding to a halt. It sniffed the air. Snorted. It knew I was close. The intelligence behind those dead eyes was the most terrifying part. It wasn't mindlessly hungry, it was tactically searching. I scanned the office. It belonged to someone important. Flags in the corner. Pictures of the president on the wall. And on the desk, a hard-line phone. Dead, obviously. But next to it, a schematic. A blueprint of the facility. My eyes traced the lines in the gloom. We were on level 2. The facility went down to level 10. The armory wasn't on this floor. The main armory was on level 5. But on level 9. Level 9 was labeled Atmospheric Control/Power Gen. If I wanted to breathe, if I wanted to turn the lights on or open the electronic locks, I had to go down. Into the dark. The creature prowled back toward the broken window. I could see its shadow stretching across the floor, elongated and twisted. I gripped my knife in my left hand, the rifle in my right. Then, a sound saved me. From deeper in the facility, below us, a klaxon began to wail. It was distant, muffled by layers of concrete, but it was rhythmic. An alarm. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. It let out a chittering noise, almost like a bird, and then it was gone, bounding away toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. It was answering a call. I waited a full minute before moving. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped the rifle. I looked at the schematic again. The stairwell the creature used was the only way down. I had to follow it. I had to walk into the nest. I stood up, the fatigue washing over me like a tidal wave. My gear felt twice as heavy. The air in my mask was tasting metallic. The filter was failing. I checked my wrist compass. North. The mountains were north. Freedom was north. But survival was down. I stepped out of the office, back into the kill zone of the corridor. The black blood of the first creature was beginning to smoke, melting the floor tile. Highly acidic. Another surprise from the boys at DARPA. I moved toward the stairwell door. It was propped open by a severed human arm, still clutching a keycard. I stepped over it, staring into the abyss of the spiraling concrete stairs. The lights were out completely down there. Just a gaping throat of darkness leading to the bowels of the earth. I clicked my fresh battery on, the night vision whining to life. The stairs were slick with slime. And scratched into the wall, right at eye level, someone had carved a message with a knife tip. It was fresh. The concrete dust was still on the floor. They are changing. Don't let them touch you. Protocol Black is evolution. I took a breath of the stale, dying air, adjusted my grip on the rifle, and took the first step down. 9 levels to go. And the deeper I went, the louder the silence became. The silence of the stairwell was heavier than the darkness. It wasn't empty, it was pressurized. Every step I took down that spiraling throat of concrete felt like I was descending into the stomach of a sleeping god, hoping not to wake it. My boots were quiet, wrapped in rags I'd scavenged days ago, but on the metal grating of the stairs, even a heartbeat sounded like a drum. I kept the rifle pulled tight into my shoulder, the barrel traversing the corners, counting the floors as I descended. Level 3. The door was welded shut. Someone had taken a blowtorch to the frame, sealing whatever was inside. But the steel was bowed outward, convex, as if something immense had thrown itself against the metal repeatedly, denting 3 inches of reinforced blast shielding. I could hear them behind it. Not the frantic scratching of the fresh infected, but a slow, wet rhythmic thudding. Like meat being tenderized. I didn't stop. I didn't want to know what kind of patients lived behind that door. Level 4. The air grew colder here. The chemical smell that permeated the upper labs, the scent of formaldehyde and bleach, was gone, replaced by something copper and ancient. Old blood. Dried and flaking. The door to level 4 was hanging off its hinges. I paused on the landing, my finger hovering over the trigger guard. This was the barracks level, where the on-site security forces slept, where the men who were supposed to contain this nightmare had lived. I needed supplies. My filter was struggling, each breath requiring a conscious effort to pull air through the clogged charcoal. It tasted like sucking on a penny. I stepped off the landing and into the level 4 corridor. It was a massacre. But not a chaotic one. It was a firing line. Skeletal remains and shredded fatigues lay in a perfect row against the far wall, their skulls punctuated by single, neat holes. They hadn't been overrun by zombies. They had been executed. I moved closer, stepping over a dried pool of black fluid. The patches on their shoulders were different. Not standard army. Not Marines. They wore a black patch with a simple white double helix struck through by a lightning bolt. Project Distinct. I knelt beside a corpse that still had a tactical rig attached. I stripped the magazine's 5.56 NATO green tip. Good. Armor piercing. I checked his mask. The lens was cracked, useless. I cursed silently, the CO2 buildup in my own mask starting to make my vision swim with black spots. I needed air. That's when I saw it. A clipboard clutched in the dead soldier's hand, his rigor mortis grip so tight I had to snap the finger bones to pry it loose. The document was stamped eyes only protocol black. The paper was stained, but legible. I shone my dying light on the text, skimming the military jargon. Subject response to strain Delta exceeds expectations. Integration of ballistic ceramics into epidermal layer observed in 40% of subjects. Intelligence retention high. Pack tactics high. Warning: do not engage with standard ball ammunition. Aim for the joints. Protocol Black is no longer a containment measure. It is a weaponization field test. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The government hadn't just found this virus. They were tweaking it. They were trying to build super soldiers, and instead, they built monsters that wore their failure like armor. The creature upstairs, the one with the plates fused to its chest, it wasn't wearing the armor. It was growing around it. The virus was integrating the gear into the host's biology. A noise from the far end of the barracks snapped my head up. A wet clicking sound. Like a tongue hitting the roof of a mouth. I killed my light instantly. Total darkness enveloped me, save for the faint green phosphorescence of the emergency exit signs. Click. 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 It was coming from the ceiling. I backed up slowly, my boots sliding over the slick floor. I looked up. The drop ceiling tiles were missing in patches, revealing the ductwork and pipes above. Something was moving in the crawlspace. I could hear the metal flexing, the soft scrape of claws on galvanized steel. It wasn't the tank from upstairs. This was something lighter. Faster. I retreated to the stairwell, keeping my weapon trained on the ceiling. I didn't have the ammo for a guessing game in the dark. I slipped through the door and started down again, moving faster now. The air in my mask was getting hot, stifling. I was recycling too much carbon dioxide. My hands started to tingle. Hypoxia. Level 5. The armory. If there was salvation, it was here. The door to level 5 was intact, a heavy magnetic lock sealing it. I fumbled for the severed arm I'd carried from upstairs, a gruesome key, and pressed the cold, dead hand against the biometric scanner. A red laser swiped over the fingerprint. Identity confirmed. Welcome, Colonel Vance. The hydraulics hissed, and the door groaned open, revealing a cavernous room bathed in rotating amber warning lights. I stepped inside, and for a moment, the sheer volume of hardware took my breath away. Racks of rifles. Cases of grenades. Anti-tank weaponry. It was a prepper's wet dream, or a pacifist's nightmare. But the room wasn't empty. In the center of the armory, sitting on a crate of ammunition, was a figure. It wasn't moving. It wore the white lab coat of a scientist, but the coat was stained a deep, crusty brown. The figure was hunched over, facing away from me. I raised my rifle. "Don't move," I croaked, my voice rough from the bad air. The figure didn't react. I strafed to the side, getting a better angle. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. The head was split open like a blooming flower, the skull fragments pushed outward by a pulsating mass of pink and gray tissue that glowed faintly. It was breathing, the tissue expanding and contracting. It was connected to the wall by thick, fleshy veins that ran along the floor like roots, tapping into the facility's power grid. A node. A biological router. I realized then why the creature upstairs had run when the alarm sounded. They weren't just communicating with screams, they were networked. This thing, this former scientist, was a localized hub. I ignored it for the moment, my lungs burning. I scanned the shelves. There. A clean row of M50 gas masks. I holstered my rifle, ripped the old mask off my face, and gasped, choking on the unfiltered air of the room. It smelled of ozone and rotting meat. I jammed the fresh mask on, cleared the seal, and took a deep breath. Cold, clean air flooded my lungs. The dizziness faded. I grabbed a tactical vest from a rack, transferring my mags. I swapped my beat-up civilian AR-15 for a military-grade 416 Hong Kong dollars with a suppressor and a thermal optic. I was upgrading. I was evolving, just like them. Then, the clicking started again. It was louder this time. Inside the room. I spun around, bringing the thermal optic up to my eye. The room washed into shades of blue and purple. The pulsating brain thing in the center glowed hot white. But there was something else. Clinging to the wall above the weapon racks. A heat signature. Elongated. For arms. It wasn't the tank. It was the climber from the vents. The creature detached from the wall, dropping silently to the floor. Through the thermal scope, I could see its heat signature flaring in its chest, a rapid, hummingbird metabolism. It didn't have eyes. Just a smooth, pale dome of bone where a face should be, and massive, bat-like ears that twitched independently. A listener. It turned its head toward me, sensing the shift in air pressure caused by my movement. It let out a low hiss, opening a mouth filled with needle teeth. I squeezed the trigger. The suppressed shot was a dull thwip. The round took the creature in the shoulder, spinning it around. It didn't scream. It vanished. It moved so fast my eyes couldn't track it, a blur of motion darting behind a row of lockers. I held my breath, scanning the room. The thermal scope ghosted, trying to keep up. Asterisk clang. Asterisk. To my left. I fired 2 rounds into the darkness. Sparks flew off a metal cabinet. Asterisk clang. Asterisk. Behind me. I spun, dropping to a knee. The creature launched itself from the top of a weapon rack, limbs outstretched. I fired blindly, the recoil hammering my shoulder. The rounds impacted its chest, punching through the thin, pale skin, but it didn't stop. It slammed into me, knocking the wind out of my lungs and sending the rifle skittering across the floor. We hit the ground hard. It was heavy, dense muscle and bone. Its claws raked across my new vest, shredding the Kevlar but failing to penetrate the ceramic plate beneath. Its breath washed over my mask, hot and stinking of raw iron. It snapped its jaws at my face, the teeth screeching against the polycarbonate lens of my mask. I scrambled for my sidearm, but my arm was pinned. The creature was incredibly strong, its limbs locking around me like a python. It wasn't trying to eat me, it was trying to crush me. My hand found something on my belt. The frag grenade. The one I hadn't used upstairs. I didn't have room to throw it. But I had the element of insanity. I yanked the pin with my left hand and shoved the grenade down the back of the creature's collar, between its neck and the spine. Get off! I screamed, kicking upward with both legs. I caught it in the stomach, leveraging every ounce of adrenaline I had. The creature stumbled back, confused by the metal object wedged against its flesh. I rolled. I didn't run. I dove behind the heavy steel desk of the quartermaster, curling into a ball, opening my mouth to equalize the pressure. Boom. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. Shrapnel pinged off the desk like hail. A wet, sloppy sound followed, the sound of wet matter hitting the walls. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. I lay there for a second, checking my limbs. Still attached. I stood up, swaying. The listener was gone. In its place was a crater of gore and a pair of severed legs twitching on the floor. The upper torso had been vaporized. I grabbed my rifle, checking the action. It was still good. I turned back to the pulsating node in the center of the room. The explosion had damaged it. The glass container was cracked, black fluid leaking out. The human remnant inside was thrashing, its mouth opening in a silent scream. As it died, the lights in the armory flickered and surged. The connection was broken. I walked over to the node and put a single round into the center of the pulsating mass. The glow faded. The room went silent, save for the hum of the ventilation. I was geared up. I had air. I had weapons. But I had also just rung the dinner bell. The explosion would have been heard 5 levels up and 5 levels down. I grabbed a satchel charge from the demolition shelf, C4 with a remote detonator. You never knew when you needed to bring the house down. I moved back to the door, stepping over the remains of the listener. Level 5 was clear. But the schematic I saw earlier burned in my mind. Level 9. Atmospheric control. I checked the stairwell door. The scratch marks here were different. Deeper. Gouges in the steel that looked like they were made by industrial equipment. Or claws the size of scythes. Protocol black, I whispered to myself, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. Evolution. I wasn't just fighting zombies. I was fighting the next stage of life on Earth. And I was hopelessly obsolete. I pushed the door open and began the descent to level 6. The air got warmer. The silence got louder. And from the darkness below, a new sound emerged. Not a growl. Not a scream. Singing. A distorted loop of a recorded voice, echoing up the shaft. Star-Spangled Banner, yet wave. It was coming from the PA system on level 8. Someone, or something, had turned on the national anthem. I tightened my grip on the rifle and descended into the abyss. The anthem wasn't comforting. In the claustrophobic concrete throat of the stairwell, the brassy, distorted recording of the national anthem sounded less like a pledge of allegiance, and more like a funeral dirge for a civilization that had already bled out. The acoustics of the silo turned the trumpet blasts into mournful, warping groans that vibrated against the cartilage of my ears. I kept my back to the wall, the suppressed rifle raised, placing my feet with the deliberation of a bomb disposal technician. Every step down the steel grate stairs sent a tiny vibration through the structure, a dinner bell for anything sensitive enough to feel it. The air grew heavier here. It wasn't just the heat anymore, it was the pressure. The deep earth pressing in on all sides, millions of tons of Appalachian rock trying to crush this titanium bubble. Level 6. The stencil on the blast door was faded, obscured by a splatter of dried black bile, medical research/pathology. The door was slightly ajar, jammed open by the crushed remains of a gurney. I peered through the gap. The thermal scope showed a landscape of cooling blues and purples. Nothing warm. No movement. But the smell. Even through the high-grade filters of my mask, I could taste the copper tang of old slaughter. I squeezed through the gap, my vest scraping against the steel. Inside, the emergency lighting had failed completely. I was navigating by the green phosphor bloom of my night vision and the narrow cone of my rifle light. This wasn't a hospital. It was a factory. Rows of reinforced glass cells lined the walls, shattered from the inside out. In the center of the room, surgical tables were bolted to the floor, complete with heavy leather straps and shock collars. This wasn't where they treated the infected. This is where they studied them. This is where they tried to take the monsters apart to see what made them tick, only to realize the clockwork was eating the watchmaker. I moved toward a nurse's station, or what passed for one in this dungeon. It was a fortified pillbox in the center of the ward. I vaulted the counter, boots crunching on broken vials and spent casings. I needed intel. I needed to know what Protocol Black meant before I walked into the Atmospheric Control Center on Level 9. A terminal on the desk was dead, but a clipboard lay next to a skeletal hand, the bones still clutching a tactical pen. I pried the clipboard loose. The paper was yellowed, brittle as dead leaves, but the red ink stamp was still visible, eyes only Yasamriad. I scanned the clinical handwriting, my light cutting across the page. Subject 814. Mutation rate exceeds projection. Host retains localized muscle memory but higher cortical function is repurposed for predatory efficiency. The virus is not killing the host. It is optimizing it. Conventional ballistics ineffective against Stage 3 ossification. Recommendation: Protocol Black. Total atmospheric purge. If we cannot cure the vector, we must deny it oxygen. I lowered the clipboard, a cold chill sweating down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Protocol Black wasn't a rescue plan. It wasn't a containment strategy. It was an extermination order. The government realized the soldiers down here weren't just dying, They were evolving into something superior to humans. So they decided to suffocate the entire facility. They buried their own army to hide the mistake. And I was walking right into the kill zone. A sharp beep from my wrist computer snapped me back to reality. Asterisk air filter, 15%. Asterisk. The fight in the armory, the heavy breathing, the adrenaline. I was burning through my scrubbers faster than anticipated. 15% meant 10 minutes of heavy exertion, maybe 20 if I sat still and meditated. I didn't have 20 minutes. I scanned the medical bay. There had to be supplies. I began rifling through the cabinets, tossing aside useless 4 bags and decayed bandages. Nothing. The looters, or the desperate survivors, had picked this place clean years ago. Then I saw it. Across the room, inside one of the shattered containment cells. A wall-mounted emergency cabinet. O2 emergency. I vaulted back over the counter, moving fast. Silence was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. I reached the cell. The glass was blown out, shards the size of guillotines hanging from the frame. I stepped through, glass crunching loudly. The cabinet was locked. I used the butt of my rifle, smashing the latch. Inside, a single, pristine yellow filter cartridge sat in shrink wrap. Salvation. I grabbed it, tearing the plastic with my teeth. I had to be fast. The moment I unscrewed my current filter, I would be exposed to the super-concentrated viral spores of the deep silo. I held my breath. Asterisk click. Hiss. Asterisk. I unscrewed the spent filter. The air in the room hit my damp skin like a physical blow, heavy and smelling of ancient death. My lungs burned, begging to inhale, but I knew a single breath could rewrite my DNA. My hands shook as I aligned the threads of the new filter. Asterisk scrape. Fumble. Asterisk. Come on, I thought, black spots dancing in my vision. Asterisk click. Twist. Asterisk. The seal locked. I gasped, sucking in the chemically treated, stale air. It tasted like charcoal and rubber, but it was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. As my vision cleared, I noticed something on the floor of the cell. Something I had stepped over. It was a pile of rags. No, not rags. A nest. Made of shredded scrubs, hair, and teeth. Hundreds of human teeth, pulled out and arranged in a spiral pattern. And in the center of the nest, a heat signature bloomed on my thermal scope. Not on the floor. Asterisk above me. Asterisk. I threw myself backward just as the ceiling tile exploded. A creature dropped, landing on all fours where I had been standing a second ago. It was small, skeletal, its skin translucent, and stretched tight over warped bones. No eyes. Just a massive, gaping mouth and limbs that were too long, possessing too many joints. A runt. In the wasteland, runts were scavengers. Here, in the dark, they were something else. It shrieked, a high-pitched frequency that scrambled the audio sensors in my headset. I fired from the hip. The .556 round took it in the midsection, blowing it back against the wall. It thrashed, blue blood spraying, and tried to scuttle into a vent. I put a second round through its skull. It went limp. But the shriek had done its job. From the corridor outside, the darkness erupted. The slow, rhythmic shuffling I had ignored earlier suddenly accelerated. I sprinted for the door, abandoning stealth. I hit the stairwell, slamming the heavy steel door behind me and spinning the locking wheel. Asterisk thud. 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 Asterisk. Bodies slammed against the other side. Not one or two. Dozens. The medical staff wanted to see the doctor. I backed away, chest heaving, checking my ammo count. 2 mags left for the rifle. 3 for the pistol. And the C4. I turned and ran down the stairs. Level 7 passed in a blur of industrial piping and steam tunnels. I didn't stop. The heat was intensifying. The walls here were sweating, condensation dripping down through layers of rust and grime. And then, the music got louder. Rock, ETS. Red, Glare. The distortion was hideous, a demonic choir stretching the vowels into infinity. Level 8. Barracks/recreation. The door to level 8 was gone. Blown off its hinges. The opening was a jagged maw leading into a cavernous space. I slowed down, raising the rifle. The thermal scope was useless here. The ambient heat from the steam pipes washed everything out in a sea of red and orange. I switched to standard night vision. The mess hall. It was massive. Hundreds of tables overturned. Trays scattered. But it was the center of the room that stopped me cold. The tables had been cleared to form a circle. In the center, a mountain of furniture, debris, and bones had been constructed into a crude effigy. And sitting on top of the pile, surrounded by speakers wired into the PA system, was a radio receiver. The anthem was blaring from it, shaking the dust from the ceiling. But the radio wasn't the threat. Standing around the pile, swaying to the distorted rhythm, were the soldiers. 20 of them. Maybe 30. They were still wearing their fatigue pants and combat boots, their torsos bare and gray, criss-crossed with black veins. They weren't rotting. They were preserved. Calcified. They were sentinels. Unlike the ferals up top, sentinels didn't wander. They stood guard. They entered a state of hibernation until a threat presented itself. And they were armored. Patches of bone had grown over their shoulders and chests, natural plate carriers formed from their own mutating skeletons. I was 50 yards from the exit on the far side, the bulkhead leading to level 9, and the atmospheric controls. I could try to sneak. But the floor was covered in metal trays and debris. One step, one sound over the music, and 30 armored super soldiers would swarm me. I looked at the radio atop the pile. The wires ran up to the ceiling, disappearing into a conduit. If I cut the power, the music stops. If the music stops, the silence might wake them up just as fast as a gunshot. Think, I hissed. I looked at the satchel charge on my belt. The C4. Protocol Black was about suffocation. It was about air. I scanned the ceiling. Running the length of the mess hall was the main ventilation trunk, a massive aluminum duct large enough to crawl through. It was suspended by chains, directly over the heads of the sentinels. If I could get up there, I could crawl over them. I holstered the rifle and moved to the wall. A maintenance ladder ran up to a catwalk. I climbed, every muscle tense, timing my movements with the crescendo of the anthem. Bombs bursting in air. I reached the catwalk. Below me, the sea of gray flesh swayed. I could see the bone plates on their backs, thick and jagged. I moved along the catwalk until I was parallel with the duct. I pulled the knife from my boot. I needed to pry the service hatch open. I reached out, jamming the blade into the seam of the duct. Asterisk screech. Asterisk. Metal on metal. The music masked it. Mostly. One of the sentinels below stopped swaying. It turned its head, looking up. Its face was a featureless mask of bone, save for a mouth full of jagged fangs. It sniffed the air. I froze, merging with the shadows. The creature let out a low growl, a sound like grinding stones, then turned back to the radio. I exhaled slowly. I pried the hatch again, gentler this time. It popped open. I slid inside the duct. It was tight, dusty, and smelled of ozone. I crawled, dragging my rifle, the metal reverberating softly with my weight. I was halfway across the room, directly over the horde, when the music stopped. Not a fade-out. A cut. The radio died. The silence that followed was heavier than the rock above us. I froze in the duct. Below, the shuffling of boots stopped. Then a sound. Asterisk sniff. Sniff. Asterisk. 30 heads turned upward. They couldn't see me, but they could hear the beat of my heart against the aluminum floor of the vent. Then, the metal beneath me groaned. The supports. They were old. The vibration of the music had held them together. Or maybe I was just heavier than I thought. Asterisk creak. Asterisk. A chain snapped. The section of the duct I was in dropped 2 feet, swinging wildly. I slammed against the side of the metal tube. Below, the scream began. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a hive mind engaging a target. Asterisk clang. Asterisk. Something hit the bottom of the duct. Then again. Fists. Bone-plated fists punching through the aluminum from below. Claws ripped through the thin metal inches from my face. They were tearing the ventilation shaft down to get to me. Protocol black, I muttered, flipping the safety off my rifle. Let's see if you can breathe fire. I rolled onto my back in the cramped space, pointing the muzzle at the floor of the duct as it began to tear open like a soda can. The gray hands were reaching in, grasping blindly. I pulled the trigger. The muzzle flash in the confined aluminum tube was blinding, a strobe light of violence that illuminated the nightmare reaching for me. In the cramped darkness of the ventilation shaft, the roar of the rifle was amplified tenfold. A physical blow to the eardrums that drowned out even the shrieks of the creatures below. I fired blindly through the tearing metal, aiming for the gray fingers hooking into the aluminum. Rounds sparked against the bone-plated knuckles of the sentinels, chipping away calcium but failing to stop the kinetic force of their ascent. They weren't climbing, they were surging, a tide of calcified muscle and rage pushing against the fragile infrastructure of the ceiling. The duct lurched again. The rivets popping sounded like gunfire, a zipper of structural failure running down the length of the mess hall. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on dust that had settled continuously since the early 90s. Kicking at a hand that had punched through the floor of the vent. The fingers were hard as stone, cold and unyielding, grabbing my ankle with the grip of a hydraulic press. I screamed, a raw sound lost in the cacophony, and emptied the remainder of the magazine into the forearm. The limb disintegrated into a spray of black ichor and bone shards, but the momentum was already shifting. Gravity, the oldest enemy, finally collected its due. The chain directly above my head snapped with the sound of a cracking whip. The world tilted violently. The sensation of weightlessness lasted for a heartbeat, a terrifying pause before the slam. The entire 10-foot section of the ventilation trunk sheared away from the ceiling and plummeted into the center of the mess hall. We hit the pile of debris, the effigy of furniture and bones, with a crash that shook the fillings in my teeth. The impact knocked the wind out of me, a hard reset to my nervous system. I lay there for a second in the ruin of the aluminum coffin, gasping for air that tasted of copper and ancient dust. My vision swimming in a haze of green static from the night vision goggles. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that masked the immediate danger. I rolled over, coughing, shoving a piece of jagged sheet metal off my legs, and scrambled out of the wreckage. I was in the center of the room. The kill box. The thermoscope was dead, shattered in the fall. I ripped the optics off the rail and threw them aside, relying on the ambient emergency lights that flickered with dying reactor power. The red strobe cast long, dancing shadows, turning the sentinels into flickering demons. They were slow to recover from the impact of the falling duct, but they were rising. And they were massive. Up close, the sentinels were a grotesquerie of biological warfare. The bone plates I had seen from above weren't just calluses. They were exoskeletal protrusions. Ribs that had cracked and reknit on the outside of the skin, forming a natural cage over their vital organs. Their faces were the worst part. The eyes were gone, sealed over by thick ridges of calcium. They didn't need to see. They hunted by vibration, by the displacement of air. And right now, I was the loudest thing in the room. I swapped magazines, my hands trembling with adrenaline. The bolts slammed home. The sound was a dinner bell. 3 of them lunged simultaneously. They didn't run like the ferals. They charged like linebackers, heads down, shoulders forward. I fired. Controlled bursts. Center mass was useless. The rounds sparked off the chest plates like they were hitting steel targets. I adjusted my aim, dropping to a knee, targeting the legs. The 5.56 rounds shredded the soft tissue of the thighs, shattering the femurs. The lead sentinel collapsed, skidding across the linoleum floor, but it didn't scream. It just crawled, clawing the ground, pulling its broken body toward me with relentless determination. Headshots, I whispered to myself, backing away as the circle tightened. Always headshots. I put 2 rounds into the skull of the second attacker. The bone mask exploded, exposing the gray matter beneath, and it dropped. But there were too many. 20, maybe 30 of them, stepping over the fallen, closing the gap. I was backed against the heavy oak table, the exit bulkhead 50 yards away through a maze of overturned furniture. I checked my belt. 1 flashbang. It was a gamble. These things were blind, but their hearing was hypersensitive. If I could overload their sensory input, I might buy a window. I pulled the pin, cooked it for a second, and lobbed it into the center of the approaching pack. I squeezed my eyes shut and clamped my hands over my ears. Asterisk bang. Asterisk. The concussion hit me in the chest, a physical wave of pressure. Even with my eyes closed, the flash burned red through my eyelids. The reaction from the horde was instantaneous and chaotic. They shrieked, clutching their heads, stumbling into one another, swinging their armored fists blindly at the air. It was a cacophony of confusion, a mosh pit of monsters. I didn't wait. I vaulted the table and sprinted. My lungs burned, the filtered air from my mask coming in thin, wheezing gasps. I dodged a swinging arm that could have taken my head off, the wind of the blow ruffling my hair. I scrambled over a pile of trays, my boots crunching on brittle bones, ignoring the pain in my bruised ribs. The bulkhead was ahead. A massive slab of steel painted with hazard stripes. Level 9 atmospheric control. I slammed my shoulder into the locking wheel. It wouldn't budge. Rusted. Or locked from the other side. Behind me, the shrieking was changing tone. The confusion was fading. They were reacquiring the target. Come on, come on! I gritted my teeth, holstering the rifle to use both hands. I braced my foot against the frame and heaved. The rust screamed, flakes of orange metal raining down, and the wheel turned. 1 rotation. 2. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping pressure. A hand grabbed my shoulder. I didn't look. I spun, drawing the combat knife from my vest in a single fluid motion, and drove it upward. The blade slid between the bone plates of the sentinel's neck, severing the spine. The creature went limp, its massive weight pinning me against the door. I shoved the corpse aside, the stench of rot and ozone overpowering the filter's charcoal scrubbers, and threw myself through the open hatch. I spun the internal wheel, locking the dogs just as a fist slammed into the steel from the outside. The metal boomed like a gong, bowing inward slightly. Then again. Asterisk boom. Asterisk asterisk boom. Asterisk. Then silence. I slid down the door, sitting on the cold metal grating of the floor, hyperventilating. I checked the display on my wrist. Heart rate, 160. Oxygen tank pressure, 15%. 15%. That was maybe 20 minutes of heavy exertion, or an hour if I sat still and died quietly. I stood up, legs shaky, and turned to face level 9. This wasn't a military base anymore. It was a machine. The room was a cavernous industrial cathedral, dominated by 4 massive turbines that stretched into the darkness above. Pipes the size of redwood trunks crisscrossed the walls, labeled with faded stencils, oxygen, nitrogen, CO2 scrubber. The air here was different. It was heavy, stagnant, and freezing cold. The humidity was gone, stripped away by the industrial dryers, leaving the atmosphere brittle and sharp. But it wasn't empty. Scattered across the floor, huddled against the base of the turbines, were the bodies. Not infected. Not skeletons. These were mummies. Desiccated corpses in pristine dress uniforms, preserved by the dry, cold air. Hundreds of them. They were sitting in rows, some holding hands, some clutching clipboards. There was no sign of violence. No blood. No struggle. I walked toward the nearest console, the sound of my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the vast, silent chamber. The corpse in the chair was wearing the stars of a general. His skin was like parchment, stretched tight over his skull. On the desk in front of him lay a binder. Red cover. Stamped with black ink. Project, Black Lung/Protocol 77. I opened it. The pages were brittle, cracking as I turned them. I scanned the logs, the final orders given 20 years ago. Asterisk. Containment breach in sectors 1 to 4 confirmed. Airborne variant Delta 6 holds 98% infection rate within localized airflow. Standard filtration ineffective. The virus binds to oxygen molecules. It rides the air we breathe. Asterisk. My blood ran cold. I looked at the date. This was 3 days after the initial outbreak. Asterisk. Command decision ratified. To prevent surface contamination and preserve the secure command bunker in the summit, lower-level air circulation must be terminated. Vents sealed. Oxygen scrubbers reversed to create negative pressure vacuum in levels 5 through 8. Asterisk. I looked up at the massive pipes overhead. They weren't pumping air down. They were sucking it up. Protocol Black wasn't about fighting the infected. It was a purge. The military high command had suffocated thousands of their own personnel, soldiers, cooks, mechanics, families sheltering in the barracks, just to create a firebreak of airless vacuum between them and the virus. They choked them out. But the log had an addendum, scrawled in handwriting that became increasingly erratic. Asterisk. Vacuum ineffective. Subjects did not expire. Without oxygen, the virus mutated. Anaerobic adaptation observed. Subject's bone density increasing. Aggression heightened. They are evolving in the dark. We hear them in the pipes. They are climbing the vents. Asterisk. The general hadn't died of the virus. I saw the pistol on the floor near his hand. He had opted out before the sentinels broke through the floor. My suit alarm beeped. A sharp, piercing chirp. Warning, filter integrity critical. O2 levels 8%. The sound startled me, but it also woke up something else. From the far end of the turbine hall, near the massive intake fans, a shadow detached itself from the machinery. It was tall. Taller than the sentinels. It wore the tattered remnants of a hazmat suit, fused to its body. On its back, tanks of liquid oxygen were bolted directly into its flesh, tubes running into its chest and throat. It hissed, a sound like a leaking steam valve. It was breathing. It was the only thing in this tomb that was breathing. And it was guarding the only fresh air filters left in the mountain. I raised my rifle, checking the chamber. 1 mag left. No explosives. And a boss monster standing between me and the ability to take my next breath. Protocol black, I muttered, the edges of my vision starting to blur as the CO2 built up in my mask. You didn't kill them. You just made them stronger. The creature stepped into the light. It didn't have a face. It had a gas mask fused to its skull, the lenses cracked and glowing with a faint, bioluminescent fungus growing inside. It revved up, a low mechanical hum emanating from the equipment embedded in its torso. I took a step back, my boot hitting the general's desk. The creature tilted its head. It could hear the air wheezing in my regulator. It let out a roar that wasn't vocal. It was the sound of a compressor engaging, a blast of pressurized air that blew dust across the room. It started to run. I didn't have the ammo to kill it. I knew that instantly. I needed to use the room. I needed to use the protocol against it. I looked at the main console. The manual override for the turbine intake. If I could reverse the flow, turn the suction into a blast, I might be able to knock it back, or better yet, feed it into the blades. But the console was on the other side of the room. Behind the monster. All right, I wheezed, my head pounding. Let's see who can hold their breath the longest. I sprinted. I lunged across the gap between the general's desk and the first row of turbines, my boots skidding on the polished concrete floor. The sound behind me was terrifying, a wet, pressurized thumping, like a massive piston firing in rhythm with a drowning gasp. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford the milliseconds it would cost. The air in my suit was thick, tasting of recycled rubber and despair, every breath requiring a conscious effort to pull through the clogged filters. The warning light on my HUD blinked a rhythmic red, syncing with the pounding in my temples. 7% oxygen. The world was beginning to narrow, the periphery of my vision dissolving into a static fuzz of purple and gray. I vaulted over a low retaining wall, landing hard on a metal grate that screamed under my weight. Below me, in the shadows beneath the floor, I could see the massive intake fans, motionless blades the size of helicopter rotors. Caked in 20 years of dust and silence. The creature roared again, but this time the sound was accompanied by the screech of tearing metal. I risked a glance. The thing, this walking iron lung, had plowed through the heavy oak desk like it was made of balsa wood, sending the mummified general and his damning binder scattering across the floor in a cloud of bone dust. It didn't slow down. It moved with a loping, uneven gait. The heavy oxygen tanks bolted to its spine, shifting with a metallic clanking noise that echoed off the cathedral ceiling. It was fast. Unnaturally fast for something carrying that much weight. I raised the rifle, snapping off 2 controlled bursts as I backpedaled toward the control dais. The bullets sparked harmlessly against the thick steel of the tanks on its back, ricocheting into the darkness. But one round found purchase in the soft, rubberized tubing connecting the tanks to the creature's chest. A jet of white vapor hissed out, freezing the air instantly. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't feel pain. It just adjusted its stride, the hissing leak sounding like an angry snake coiled around its neck. Protocol Black had created the ultimate soldier, one that didn't need morale, didn't need food, and apparently didn't need to be intact to keep killing. I scrambled up the metal stairs to the control platform, my lungs burning as if I'd inhaled broken glass. The hypoxia was setting in. My thoughts were becoming disjointed. I remembered a barbecue in July, the smell of charcoal. I shook my head, forcing the memory away. Focus. The console. It was a massive bank of Cold War-era technology, analog dials and heavy throw switches labeled in Cyrillic-style block letters. The military-industrial complex at its peak, built to survive a nuclear winter but crumbling under the weight of biological decay. I reached the main panel. Turbine control. The heavy plastic cover over the emergency reversal switch was yellowed and cracked. I smashed it with the butt of my rifle. The creature was at the bottom of the stairs now. It looked up at me, the bioluminescent fungus inside its cracked gas mask pulsing with a sickening green light. It raised a hand that had been fused with a pneumatic wrench, the metal and bone twisted together into a singular, rusted claw. It swung at the support strut of the stairs. The metal groaned and buckled, throwing me off balance. I slammed into the console, the impact knocking the wind out of me. My vision went black for a second, then snapped back into a blurry, high-contrast nightmare. Oxygen levels critical. 4%. I fumbled for the switch. It was rusted stuck. Of course it was. Nothing in this tomb worked the way it was supposed to. The creature began to climb, hauling its massive bulk up the stairs with terrifying strength, the metal grating bending under its grip. I could hear the mechanics inside its chest whirring, a wet biological pump forcing the liquid oxygen into its dead veins. It was close enough now that I could smell it, not rot, but ozone and chemical preservative. The smell of a laboratory that had gone to hell. I jammed the barrel of my rifle behind the switch, using it as a lever. "Come on," I wheezed, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. "Come on, you piece of junk." The creature swiped at my ankle, the pneumatic claw shredding the outer layer of my hazmat suit. The breach alarm screamed, joining the low oxygen warning in a cacophony of panic. I screamed with the effort, putting every ounce of my fading strength into the lever. With a sound like a gunshot, the rust gave way. The switch slammed down. For a second, nothing happened. The creature grabbed my boot, dragging me toward the edge of the platform. I clawed at the console, my fingers slipping on the smooth metal. I looked into the face of the thing. The human eyes were gone, replaced by glowing fungal stalks pushing against the glass of the mask. It opened its mouth to roar, a sound of triumph. Then, the mountain shuddered. Deep beneath the floor, the magnetic coils of the turbines engaged. The hum started as a vibration in my teeth and escalated instantly into a deafening roar. The air pressure in the room dropped so fast my ears popped painfully. The dust on the floor didn't just move, it vanished, sucked violently toward the intake vents behind the creature. Protocol Black had designed these fans to purge the entire sector in seconds. The creature froze. The sudden shift in air pressure seemed to confuse its sensors. The suction grabbed the leaking vapor from its damaged tank, pulling it backward. It dug its claws into the grating, sparks flying as it fought the invisible hand of the wind. I kicked free, scrambling behind the heavy console for cover. The roar was absolute now, a physical force that battered my body. The creature lost its footing. It flailed, the heavy tanks on its back acting like a sail in the hurricane-force draft. It let out a final, distorted screech as the suction overpowered its hydraulic strength. It flew backward, tumbling through the air like a discarded toy, and slammed into the intake grate of Turbine 3. The result was gruesome and instantaneous. The sheer pressure held it against the mesh, compressing the tanks, the flesh, and the suit into a singular mass. Then, the blades behind the grate spun up to full speed. There was a sickening crunch of metal and bone, followed by a spray of black ichor that misted the entire lower level. The creature was gone, mulched by the very machinery it had been guarding. I lay huddled behind the console, gasping for air that wasn't there. My suit was compromised. My tank was empty. The room was spinning. I crawled, dragging my numb legs, toward the emergency supply locker visible on the far wall, near the shattered remains of the general's desk. It felt like miles. Every inch was a negotiation with unconsciousness. I reached the locker. Locked. I didn't have the energy to shoot the lock. I used the last of my adrenaline to smash the glass pane with my elbow. I grabbed a fresh filter cartridge, green stripe, military grade. I ripped the old, spent filter from my mask, holding my breath as the unfiltered, stagnant air of the room touched my face. It was freezing, dry, and carried the metallic tang of the atomized creature. I slammed the new filter into the port, and twisted it until it clicked. I took a breath. The air rushed in, clean and sharp. It burned my throat, but it was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. I lay there on the cold concrete for a long time, just breathing, watching the dust motes dance in the dying light of the emergency strobes. My HUD slowly ticked up. Oxygen levels, 100%. Filter integrity, 98%. I sat up, my head swimming but clearing. The turbines were still roaring, scrubbing the air, pulling the stagnation out of the deep levels. I walked back to the general's desk, or what was left of it. The red binder lay open, pages torn but legible. I picked it up, brushing off the bone dust. I turned to the last page. The handwriting was different here. Clinical. Precise. Asterisk subject 89 Delta. Transformation complete. The fusion of the rebreather apparatus to the thoracic cavity is self-sustaining. The virus utilizes the pressurized oxygen to hyperaccelerate muscle growth. We are not just surviving the vacuum. We are weaponizing it. If Command does not send extraction within 24 hours, I will release the subjects into the ventilation network. Let them see what their silence has created. Asterisk. It was signed by the chief medical officer. I looked at the gore splattered across the intake vent. That hadn't been a random mutation. The creature, the breather, was the chief medical officer. He had done that to himself. The realization hit me harder than the lack of air. This wasn't a failure of containment. It was a civil war. The scientists down here, betrayed by the surface, had used Protocol Black to turn themselves into monsters in a bid for revenge. I checked my gear. The breech in my suit was small, sealable with a patch kit from the locker. I found a box of 5.56 ammo and 3 more filters. I was alive. I was rearmed. But the path forward didn't lead to an exit. The turbine controls showed the airflow schematic. The air was being pulled from below. Level 10. The lowest point. According to the diagram, Level 10 wasn't a lab. It was labeled simply, the hive. I looked at the heavy blast doors at the far end of the hall. They were buckled outward, as if something had been trying to get out of Level 10, not in. The metal was scratched deep, gouges that were too wide for human hands, too wide even for the breather I had just killed. I reloaded my rifle, the mechanical click loud in the vast, windy chamber. The air was clear now, but the silence that followed the turbine's cycle down was heavy with threat. I had fresh air, but I knew now that air wasn't safety. In this mountain, air was just another fuel for the nightmare. I walked toward the blast doors. I had to know what was in the hive. I had to know if there was anything left of humanity down there, or if the virus had finished what the military started. The wheel on the door was cold under my hand. I began to turn it. The wheel groaned, a sound like a dying beast screaming through the rusted iron of the door. The locking mechanism fought me, calcified by years of damp mountain air and neglect. But the adrenaline still coursing through my veins gave me the leverage I needed. With a final, agonizing screech of metal shearing against metal, the blast door unlatched. It swung inward, heavy and sluggish, revealing a maw of absolute darkness that swallowed the beam of my tactical light whole. The air that drifted up from the stairwell wasn't just stale, it was thick, humid, and carried a scent that bypassed the filters of my mask to trigger a primal gag reflex. The smell of ozone, burnt copper, and something sickeningly sweet, like rotting flowers on a grave. I stepped into the stairwell, my boot landing on a grate that rattled ominously, echoing down into the abyss. The schematic in the turbine room had been a flat, sterile drawing. The reality was a vertical coffin. The emergency lights here were dead, smashed out or burned away long ago. I switched my rifle to my left shoulder, keeping my right hand free to trace the railing, guiding myself down the spiral. Every 10 steps, I passed a landing. Every landing told a story of the end of the world. On the landing for Level 8, I found the barricade. It wasn't made of furniture or debris. It was made of them. Dozens of bodies, clad in the shredded remains of Tyvek suits and tactical vests, piled high to block the upward path. But as I swept my light over the mound, the horror of Protocol Black clarified in high definition. These weren't victims of a horde. They were the horde, but they had been stopped by something efficient. The walls were riddled with holes, high caliber, armor-piercing rounds. The concrete behind the pile was painted with old, dried splatter. A heavy machine gun placement sat at the top of the stairs, the barrel melted from sustained fire. The gunner's skeleton still draped over the receiver. This was the kill box. The military had held the line here against their own scientists, against the subjects coming up from the deep. And they had lost. I climbed over the barricade, my boots crunching on brittle bone and discarded shell casings. The descent continued. The air grew heavier, pressing against my suit, creating a claustrophobic pressure that made my skin crawl. My Geiger counter, silent until now, began to click. A slow, rhythmic ticking. Low-level radiation. The reactor. The hive wasn't just a lab. It was built around the facility's nuclear heart. As I neared the bottom, the architecture changed. The utilitarian gray concrete of the upper levels gave way to something else. The walls here were lined with thick, insulated cabling, bundles as wide as tree trunks running along the ceiling and floor like arteries. But they weren't just cables anymore. Where the insulation had cracked, a gray, fibrous matter had grown, weaving into the copper and fiber optics. It looked like fungus, but it pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent rhythm. The facility was alive. The virus hadn't just infected the people, it was trying to interface with the building itself. I reached the floor of level 10. The silence here was heavy, wet. I moved forward, weapon raised, checking corners that didn't exist in the rounded, organic tunnel the corridor had become. To my left, a shattered reinforced window looked in on what used to be an armory. I needed to check it. If I was going to face the hive, I needed more than a few magazines of 5.56. I stepped through the broken frame. The armory was a wreck, racks overturned, weapons stripped. But in the corner, illuminated by the flickering spark of a severed power conduit, I saw them. They weren't moving. 3 figures, standing perfectly still, facing the wall. They were massive, clad in full EOD bomb disposal suits, heavy, layered Kevlar and ceramic plating that made them look like walking tanks. But the suits were wrong. The helmets were fused to the shoulders. The thick, blast-proof visors were opaque, painted over with that same gray biological matter. I tried to back out, silent as a ghost, but my boot snagged a loose tripwire, a claymore setup left by a paranoid quartermaster years ago. It didn't detonate. The explosive was likely a dud after all this time, but the click of the pin releasing was louder than a gunshot in the tomb-like. Silence. The 3 figures turned. They didn't stumble or shuffle like the walkers on the surface. They pivoted with mechanical precision. The heavy servos in their exoskeleton suits whined, a high-pitched electronic squeal that harmonized with the growl erupting from their throats. These weren't just infected. These were the result of Protocol Black's weaponization phase. Soldiers trapped in powered armor, the virus hot-wiring their nervous systems into the suit's hydraulics. "Run!" I whispered to myself. The center figure charged. It shouldn't have been fast. An ED suit weighs 80 pounds, but the thing moved like a linebacker. The suit's servos overtorqued by the virus's hysterical strength. It smashed through a metal shelving unit as if it were made of balsa wood. I raised my rifle and fired, a controlled burst aiming for the faceplate. The round sparked off the reinforced glass. Useless. The impact didn't even slow it down. It swung a massive, armored arm, a backhand blow that caught me in the chest plate. The force was like being hit by a truck. I flew backward, crashing through the drywall of the armory office, the wind knocked out of me, my vision whiting out. My HUD screamed warnings. Asterisk impact detected. Armor integrity 60%. Oxygen system stressed. Asterisk. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air that tasted like copper. The heavy infected, the tank, was tearing through the wall I had just crashed through. The other 2 were flanking, moving to cut off the exit. They retained tactics. That was the nightmare of the specialized infected. The virus utilized whatever muscle memory was most dominant. For a soldier, that was squad maneuvers. I needed an equalizer. My eyes darted around the ruined office. A commanding officer's desk. A safe blown open. And there, on the floor, next to a skeleton in a dress uniform, a grenade launcher. An M320, stand alone. I dove for it. It was heavy, unloaded, but a bandolier of 40mm grenades lay underneath the skeletal remains. The wall exploded inward as the tank barged into the room, debris showering my suit. I fumbled with the breech, jamming a high explosive round into the tube. The tank roared, a sound amplified by the suit's internal comm speakers, a digital distortion of human rage. It raised a fist to crush my skull. I rolled onto my back, leveled the launcher, and pulled the trigger. Asterisk thump. Asterisk. The grenade didn't have time to arm for a safety distance. It impacted the creature's chest plate and detonated at point-blank range. The blast was deafening. The overpressure wave slammed me into the floor, shattering the glass of the office window. When the dust cleared, the tank was gone. Or rather, it was in pieces. The explosion had breached the suit's integrity, and the internal pressure combined with the blast had turned the creature inside out. Black ichor coated the room. The other two armored infected paused. The violence of the explosion seemed to disrupt their coordination. I didn't give them time to recalibrate. I scrambled through the shattered window back into the main corridor, leaving the armory behind. I couldn't fight two more of those things. Not in close quarters. Not with one grenade left. I sprinted down the hall, my breath raspy and loud in my ears. The hallway widened, opening up into a massive, cavernous space. I skidded to a halt, hiding behind a pillar of concrete and rebar. I had reached the threshold. Ahead of me lay the central hub of Level 10. It was a circular chamber, vast and vaulted, dominated by the cooling towers of the geothermal reactor. But the machinery was barely visible. The hive wasn't a metaphor. The entire center of the room was a lattice of biological resin, a massive, pulsating structure that connected the reactor core to the mainframe servers. And suspended in that resin, like flies in amber, were people. Hundreds of them. They were military, scientists, maintenance staff. They were encased in the translucent webbing, tubes of organic matter running from their mouths and chests into the central mass. They weren't dead. I could see their chests rising and falling in unison. They were breathing. They were filtering. I raised my optics, zooming in on the central mass. The computer terminals near the base of the reactor were active. Green text scrolled rapidly across screens that were half swallowed by the biomass. I moved closer, keeping to the shadows, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached a console on the perimeter that was still accessible. I wiped away a layer of slime and keyed in the override from the general's red binder. The screen flickered to life. Project Lazarus // protocol black / status. Active. I read the logs, my blood running cold. Protocol Black wasn't about containment. It wasn't about killing the infected to save the world. Asterisk. Log 445. The virus does not just reanimate. It networks. By linking the subjects to the central processing unit, we have achieved a biological neural net with processing power exceeding the Pentagon's entire grid. The subjects are not just batteries, they are processors. We are uploading the strategic defense algorithms into the hive. The infected will not just be a weapon, they will be the generals of the next war. Asterisk. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The U.S. military infrastructure hadn't decayed because of incompetence. It had been cannibalized. The hive was calculating. It was thinking. The coordinated movements of the infected outside, the ambush tactics, the breather guarding the vents, it was all being directed from here. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shuddered. A low-frequency hum began to emanate from the central mass of bodies. The scrolling text on the screen stopped. It blinked once, and then a single message appeared, green letters burning into my retinas. Intruder detected. Sector 7. Awaken the Guardians. In the center of the resin tower, the largest pod began to crack. Liquid poured out, steaming as it hit the floor. A hand, twice the size of a human's, gripped the edge of the chrysalis. It wasn't clad in armor. It didn't need it. The skin was gray, plated like chitin, and covered in eyes that blinked independently. I looked at my oxygen gauge. 45%. I looked at my ammo. 1 grenade. Half a magazine. I looked at the exit, a service elevator across the vast, open chamber, blocked by the waking nightmare in the center. Protocol Black had worked. They had created the perfect soldier. And now, I had to find a way to kill it, or the hive would finish calculating the end of the human race. I slammed a fresh magazine into my rifle, took a deep breath of the filtered, recycled air, and stepped out from the shadows. "Come and get it," I whispered. The creature didn't roar. That would have been animalistic, understandable. Instead, it emitted a high-frequency shriek that tore through the audio dampeners of my helmet. A sound that wasn't born of vocal cords but of grinding tectonic plates of bone and synthesized anger. The HUD in my visor fractured into static for a split second, the biometric sensors screaming that my heart rate had spiked into the fatal range. This was the Guardian. The culmination of Protocol Black. It dropped from the chrysalis on all fours, its limbs elongated and joined with extra joints. Covered in that chitinous gray plating that looked suspiciously like carbon fiber we've grown biologically. I didn't wait for it to orient itself. I raised the rifle, sighting center mass on the torso where the plating looked thinnest, and squeezed the trigger. The suppressor's thwip 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 was lost in the vast echo of the chamber. The rounds impacted, sparking against the gray hide, but they didn't penetrate. It was like shooting at a tank with a BB gun. The creature didn't even flinch. It turned its head, those multifaceted eyes focusing on me with a mechanical precision that made my stomach turn. It wasn't just seeing me, it was calculating trajectory, velocity, and interception vectors. It moved. It was a blur of gray violence, closing the 50 yards between us in a heartbeat. I threw myself to the right, skidding across the polished concrete floor that was slick with leaking coolant and biological waste. A claw the size of a shovel slammed into the pillar I had just vacated, pulverizing the concrete and bending the rebar like pipe cleaners. I scrambled to my feet, the heavy M320 launcher swinging awkwardly against my hip, threatening to unbalance me. I couldn't use the grenade yet. Not this close. The blast radius would liquefy my organs just as effectively as it would crack the Guardian's shell. I sprinted into the maze of the hive. This area, the central processor, was a nightmare of fused technology. Server racks were overgrown with pulsating red veins, the blinking lights of the hard drives looking like frantic eyes peeking through the gore. I vaulted over a workstation where a skeletal operator was fused to his chair. His fingers still resting on a keyboard that had been swallowed by the biomass. The air here was thick, heavy with the smell of ozone and rotting meat. My rebreather clicked, a harsh, mechanical rattle. The filter was clogging. The explosion in the armory had compromised the seal, and I could taste the metallic tang of the pathogen in the back of my throat. I had maybe 20 minutes of scrubbed air left before I started breathing the raw virus. I needed distance. I needed to get across the chamber to the service elevator, but the Guardian was hurting me. It wasn't just chasing, it was cutting off angles. Every time I tried to break for the open floor, it was there. Dropping from the overhead gantries or bursting through a wall of resin-encased machinery. It was playing with me. Or testing me. I ducked under a low-hanging conduit, the heat from the geothermal pipes radiating through my suit. I found myself in a narrow alleyway formed by two massive banks of supercomputers. The heat was intense here. The cooling systems had failed, or had been repurposed to keep the biological components warm. I checked my Mag-10 rounds. And the single 40mm grenade in the launcher. That was it. I was running on fumes and adrenaline. Suddenly, the Guardian crashed down at the far end of the aisle. It blocked the exit, rising to its full height, nearly 8 feet of nightmare. In the dim emergency lighting, I saw the details I had missed before. Embedded in its shoulders and chest were fragments of tactical gear. A shredded plate carrier. A shattered night vision mount fused into its skull. This thing. It used to be one of them. A Tier 1 operator. Delta, maybe DevGru. The military hadn't just built these things from scratch. They had recycled their best warriors. The realization sickened me, but it also gave me a frantic idea. If it was still partly human, partly soldier, maybe it still had the instincts. Maybe I could use that. I didn't shoot. Instead, I reached for a flare on my belt, one of the last pieces of kit I had scavenged from the supply room 3 levels up. I cracked it. The blinding red light hissed into existence, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of the hive. The Guardian hesitated. The thermal optics in its many eyes were likely overloaded by the sudden heat source. I tossed the flare to the left, behind a rack of servers. The creature lunged for the heat signature, a reflex action drilled into it by the virus, or its former training. I broke right, scrambling up a maintenance ladder attached to the side of a cooling tower. My boots slipped on the slime-coated rungs, my breath coming in ragged, panic-induced gasps. Warning, oxygen levels at 20%, the suit whispered in my ear. I reached the catwalk, 20 feet above the floor. From here, the scale of Protocol Black was horrifyingly clear. The lattice of resin stretched out like a spiderweb, and the hundreds of bodies suspended in it were twitching in unison. As the Guardian below realized it had been tricked, it let out that psychic shriek again. And the bodies, they screamed with it. 1,000 silent mouths opening in the resin, a collective gasp of agony that resonated through the room's acoustics. The hive was a choir of the damned. The Guardian spotted me. It didn't climb the ladder. It simply crouched and leapt, defying gravity with legs built for hydraulic power. It landed on the catwalk 10 feet away, the metal grating groaning under the impact. The vibration nearly knocked me over the rail. There was nowhere to run. The catwalk ended at the blast doors of the main control room, which were sealed tight. I was trapped on a metal bridge suspended over a pit of hell, with a biological tank staring me down. It stepped forward, slowly this time. It knew I had nowhere to go. It raised a hand, fingers tipping with bone spurs, ready to gut me. I looked at the creature, then down at the cooling tower directly beneath the catwalk. It was the primary intake valve for the reactor's liquid nitrogen cooling system. A massive pipe, frosted over with white ice, humming with pressure. If I missed, I was dead. If I hit the creature, I was dead. I swung the M320 launcher up, not at the Guardian, but at the catwalk grating directly between us. Protocol this, I gritted out. I pulled the trigger. Asterisk thump. Asterisk. The grenade smashed through the weakened metal grating and detonated on impact with the cryogenic pipe below. The sound wasn't a boom. It was a crack, like the sky splitting open. A massive cloud of supercooled gas erupted upward, an expanding sphere of absolute zero. The catwalk beneath the Guardian disintegrated. The creature tried to jump, but the cold hit it instantly. Biology, no matter how mutated, cannot survive flash freezing. The gas enveloped it, turning the humidity in the air into instant ice crystals. The shockwave of cold air hit me, instantly frosting my visor. My suit's thermoregulation alarms screamed, the internal temperature dropping 40 degrees in a second. I huddled against the blast door, shivering violently, praying the seal on my suit held against the thermal shock. Below, there was a heavy, shattering crash. Like a glass statue dropped from a skyscraper. I wiped the frost from my visor with a trembling gloved hand and peered over the edge of the ruin. The Guardian was down there. Or pieces of it were. It had shattered upon impact with the reactor floor, frozen solid. Silence returned to the chamber, save for the hissing of escaping gas and the rhythmic thrumming of the hive. But the silence felt different now. The bodies in the resin had stopped twitching. The scrolling green text on the terminals below had turned to a blinking red. Critical failure. Cooling system compromised. Reactor core temp rising. I slumped against the blast door, checking my vitals. Oxygen 12%. Body temperature hypothermic. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the rifle. I had killed the Guardian, but I had started a meltdown. I turned to the blast door. It was mag-locked. I didn't have the codes. I didn't have the explosives to breach it. I was trapped on a broken bridge while a nuclear reactor beneath me began to cook itself. Then, the comms in my helmet crackled. It wasn't the static of the interference. It was a voice. Weak, distorted, but human. Unit 7. Do you copy? I froze. I tapped the side of my helmet. This is a survivor. Who is this? This is Colonel Miller. The voice rasped, sounding like he was speaking through a mouthful of blood. I'm inside the control room. I saw what you did. You bought us maybe 10 minutes. There was a grinding sound of gears, and the heavy blast doors behind me groaned. The maglocks disengaged with a heavy clunk. The doors slid open a few inches, revealing a dark room lit only by emergency strobes. Get in here, the voice said. Before the radiation cooks us both. I squeezed through the gap, stumbling into the control center. It was a mess of overturned tables and smashed monitors. In the center, slumped against the main console, was a man in a tattered dress uniform. He was clutching a sidearm in one hand and pressing a violently bleeding wound in his side with the other. His skin was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. But his eyes were clear. And on the massive screens above him, the true horror of Protocol Black was laid out in high definition. Maps of the United States. Not infection zones. Deployment zones. The hive wasn't just coordinating the infected in this mountain. It was broadcasting a signal. You broke their toy. Miller coughed, pointing a shaky finger at the screen where the reactor warnings were flashing. But you didn't break the signal. The broadcast, it's already started. I looked at the map. Red lines were arcing out from our location, connecting to other hidden bunkers across the continent. Colorado, Nevada, Alaska. They're waking them up, I whispered, the dread colder than the nitrogen gas outside. All of them. Miller nodded grimly. The Guardians. Thousands of them. Stored in every continuity of government bunker from here to the Pacific. We didn't just find a camp, son. We found the launch button. My oxygen alarm beeped again. Single digits. I looked at Miller, then at the reactor controls. Can we stop it? I asked. Miller looked at the reactor gauge, climbing into the red. He looked at his gun, then at me. "We can't stop the signal," he said softly. "But we can make sure there's nothing left here to send it. The core, if we disable the safeties completely. We can turn this mountain into a crater." He slid the pistol across the floor toward me. "I can't walk," he said. "And I'm out of ammo. The manual override is down in the engineering pit. Level 12? Beneath the reactor." I stared at the gun. Then at the screen. Thousands of those monsters, waking up. An army of unstoppable nightmares guided by a hive mind, unleashed on what was left of humanity. I picked up the pistol. Checked the chamber. 1 round. "Level 12, I repeated. "Under the reactor." "It's a one-way trip," Miller said, his eyes closing as he leaned back. "But you were never planning on walking out of here, were you?" I checked my air. 8%. "No," I said, turning back to the door. "I guess I wasn't." I stepped back out onto the broken catwalk, looking down into the abyss where the reactor glowed with a sickening, pulsating violet light. The heat was rising. The hive was screaming. It was time to finish this. The blast door sealed behind me with a finality that vibrated through the floor grating, severing the connection between the dying colonel and the dead man walking. I was alone again. The silence I had noted earlier was gone, replaced by the angry, mechanical groaning of a facility in its death throes. The reactor below was waking up, not to generate power, but to detonate. The violet light pulsing from the abyss wasn't just illumination, it was radiation, visible and angry. Ionization turning the air into a shimmering haze of death. I checked the stairwell map. Level 12 was 400 feet down. In a modern elevator, that's 20 seconds. In a failing hazmat suit with single-digit oxygen reserves and a body battered by thermal shock, it was an eternity. I took the first step onto the service gantry, and the metal screamed. The rust here wasn't natural decay. It was accelerated corrosion from the leaking biological agents. The steel was flaking away like dead skin. Every step felt like I was walking on eggshells suspended over hell. My breath was coming in ragged, shallow hitches. The suit's scrubbers were working overtime to filter out the CO2, but the taste of stale, recycled rubber filled my mouth. 7% oxygen. I had to control my heart rate. I had to stop the panic that was clawing at the back of my throat. If I hyperventilated now, I'd pass out before I hit level 10. I forced myself into a rhythm. Step. Breathe. Step. Breathe. The rhythmic thumping of the hive echoed up the shaft, a heartbeat that grew louder with every meter I descended. It sounded wet. Organic. At level 8, the environment changed. The sterile white panels of the upper labs gave way to the brittlest, exposed concrete of the military infrastructure. This wasn't the showroom, this was the boiler room. And it wasn't empty. I saw them huddled near the heat exchangers. 3 of them. They weren't the standard infected I'd fought in the woods, and they weren't the towering guardian I'd just frozen. These were the maintenance crew. Or what was left of them. The radiation leaks down here had done something hideous to the virus. They were fused to their environment. Their flesh had melted and reformed, bonding with the plastic of their hazmat suits and the metal of the pipes they clung to. They were living tumors, grotesque mounds of biological sludge that pulsed with a sick, green luminescence. I tried to creep past them, hugging the wall, my boots sliding on a slick layer of condensation. One of the fuse turned its head, or the lump of flesh that served as a head. It didn't have eyes, just raw, weeping sockets. But it could sense the heat of my suit. It let out a gurgling shriek, a sound like boiling water trapped in a pipe, and peeled itself off the wall. The sound of tearing meat echoed in the shaft. I raised the rifle, but the ammo counter flashed 0. I had forgotten. I dropped it, the weapon clattering uselessly to the floor, and pulled Miller's sidearm. 1 round. I couldn't waste it on a grunt. I holstered the pistol and grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from a wall mount. It was rusted solid to the bracket. I gritted my teeth, planting a boot against the wall, and yanked. My shoulder popped, screaming in protest, but the tool broke free with a snap of oxidized metal. The fused creature lunged. It was slow, dragging a leg that had merged with a steel grate, but its reach was terrifying. An arm, elongated and boneless, lashed out like a whip. It struck my chest plate, and the force knocked the wind out of me. The acid on its skin sizzled against my suit. My integrity alarm blared. Shielding compromised. I swung the wrench. It connected with a wet thud against the creature's skull. It didn't crunch, it squished. The thing didn't stop. It didn't feel pain. It just wrapped that gelatinous limb around my ankle and pulled. I hit the grating hard, the impact jarring my teeth. I kicked out, my boot sinking into its chest cavity, fueled by sheer, primal desperation. I wasn't going to die here, eaten by a radioactive slime mold on a staircase. I brought the wrench down again, and again, aiming for the neck. On the 4th strike, the spine, or whatever calcified structure was holding it up, snapped. The creature went limp, dissolving into a puddle of glowing bile. I scrambled backward, gasping for air that wasn't there. My oxygen alarm beeped faster. 6%. I dragged myself up. My suit was scarred, the outer layer bubbling from the creature's touch. I needed air. I needed a patch kit. I stumbled into the level 8 corridor, scanning the debris. This area was a barracks for the deep-level engineers. Bunks overturned, lockers ripped open. The story of their last moments was written in dried blood on the walls. They had barricaded themselves in, but the threat had come from the vents. I found a body in the corner, slumped over a tactical crate. He was wearing a heavy-duty chaotic environment rig, similar to mine but older, bulkier. The suit was breached at the neck, the skull inside picked clean, but the rebreather unit on his back. The indicator light was dead, but the canister looked intact. I dropped to my knees beside the corpse, my hands shaking so violently I could barely manipulate the locking clamps. "Come on," I whispered, my voice raspy and thin. "Give me a break. Just one break." I twisted the dead man's tank. It hissed, a tiny puff of pressurized gas escaping. It still had charge. I reached behind my head, fumbling for my own intake valve. This was the dangerous part. I had to disconnect my empty tank, exposing myself to the toxic, superheated air of the shaft for the seconds it took to swap them. If I fumbled, the nitrogen and radiation would cook my lungs instantly. I took a deep breath of the stale, metallic air remaining in my suit, held it, and yanked the release. The seal broke. The noise of the facility roared into my helmet, deafening, mechanical screaming. The air hit my neck like a physical blow, blistering hot and smelling of ozone and rotting meat. My vision blurred instantly. I jammed the scavenge tank into the socket, twisting blindly. It wouldn't catch. My lungs burned. The edges of my vision went black. Asterisk click. Hiss. Asterisk. The seal engaged. A rush of cold, chemically tasting oxygen flooded my helmet. I gasped, coughing violently as the fresh mix hit my starved alveoli. It wasn't full, the gauge read 40%, but it was life. It was enough. I sat there for a moment next to the skeleton of the man who saved me, staring at the floor. Beneath the grime, I saw a binder he had died protecting. The cover was stamped with the same symbol I'd seen on the Guardian's containment unit. A black circle with a jagged line running through it. Protocol Black, Asset Recovery and Deployment. I flipped it open. The pages were brittle, but the diagrams were clear. My stomach churned. This wasn't just a quarantine logs. It was a catalog. Subject 118 failed. Insufficient aggression. Subject 204 failed. Rapid cellular decay. Subject 899 success. Neural link established. Code name, Tyrant. There were photos. Rows of them. Soldiers. Civilians. Children. Strapped to tables, injected with the modified strain. They weren't trying to cure the virus. They were refining it. They were stripping away the humanity to leave only the weapon. The apocalypse wasn't an accident. It was the product launch. And the hive. The hive wasn't just controlling them. It was the sales pitch. A demonstration of a controllable undead army for the highest bidder in the chaos of the collapse. I slammed the binder shut. The rage that flared in my chest was hotter than the reactor core. Miller was right. We had to burn it all. Every inch of this mountain needed to be erased from history. I stood up, the new oxygen clearing my head, fueling my muscles. I grabbed the wrench again. I checked Miller's gun. 1 bullet. It had to be for the override. I descended past level 9, then 10. The heat became oppressive. My suit's cooling unit was failing, the internal temperature climbing into the hundreds. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. The walls were no longer concrete. They were lined with thick, insulated lead, shielding the upper levels from the reactor's fury. But the lead was buckled, warped by some immense internal pressure. At level 11, the stairs ended. The gantry had collapsed. Between me and the level 12 engineering pit was a 20-foot drop onto a labyrinth of steaming pipes and high-voltage conduits. I looked down. The violet light was blinding now. The hum of the hive was a physical vibration, rattling my teeth. I could see the reactor vessel in the center of the pit, a massive, spherical structure bristling with control rods. And around it, they were waiting. The Guardians. Not the massive one I had fought above. These were smaller, sleeker, fast attack models. There were dozens of them, suspended in translucent sacks hanging from the ceiling like bats, incubating in the radiation. The heat rising from the core was hatching them. I could see them twitching, their claws cutting through the amniotic membrane. If I dropped down there, I'd have seconds before they swarmed. I scanned the pit. The manual override console was on a raised platform on the far side, directly above the fuel pool. To get there, I had to cross the pipes, navigate the waking nightmare, and input the sequence before the radiation melted my brain or the creatures tore me apart. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a squad. I had a wrench, 1 bullet, and a tank of dead man's air. Unit 7 to Miller, I whispered, though I knew the comms were likely dead. I'm at the threshold. It's worse than we thought. They're farming them down here. Static answered me. I looked at the drop. I looked at the hanging sacks, one of which was beginning to tear open, spilling viscous fluid onto the reactor housing. A claw, slick and black, reached out, gripping the metal. It let out a low, chirping hiss that sounded like a Geiger counter going critical. "Time to go to work," I muttered. I vaulted over the railing, plummeting into the steam and the violet light. I landed hard on a primary coolant pipe, the metal slick and scalding. I slipped, my boots scrambling for purchase, barely catching myself before I fell into the electrified water below. The noise of my landing echoed through the chamber. Above me, the chirping stopped. Dozens of heads snapped toward my position. The sacks ripped open in unison. The wet slap of wet bodies hitting the metal floor surrounded me. They didn't roar. They didn't scream. They hunted in silence, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that no corpse should possess. I scrambled along the pipe, balancing like a tightrope walker over the abyss. The first runner hit the pipe behind me, its claws sparking against the steel. I swung the wrench backward without looking, feeling it connect with bone. The creature hissed and fell, but two more took its place. I was running toward the override, but I was running out of time. The reactor warnings were now audible over the facility speakers, a calm, synthetic voice announcing the end of the world. Core integrity, critical. Evacuate immediately. "I'm trying!" I yelled, leaping a gap in the pipes. The platform was 10 feet away. I braced myself for the jump. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. One of the creatures had climbed the ceiling and was dropping directly on top of me. I rolled, the creature slamming into the pipe where I had stood a microsecond before. It lashed out, its claws shredding the shoulder of my suit. The pain was sharp and instant, the seal broken. Radiation alarms screamed in my ear. I kicked it in the face, the boot connecting with its jaw, and scrambled up the ladder to the control platform. I slammed the gate shut just as 3 of them slammed into it, their limbs reaching through the mesh, snapping at my legs. I turned to the console. It was alive. The screen was a wall of red text. Manual override requires 2-key authorization. My blood ran cold. 2 keys. I only had. I checked my pockets. I had nothing. Miller hadn't given me a key. He had given me a gun. I looked at the lock mechanism. It was digital, hardened. I couldn't pick it. I couldn't hack it. Then I saw the secondary slot. Biometric override. It required a handprint. A specific handprint. I looked at the gun in my hand. Then I looked back at the pipe where I had entered. The first creature I had killed. The one fused to the wall on the stairs. It had been wearing a uniform. A commander's uniform. It wasn't on the stairs anymore. It had dragged itself to the edge of the pit, looking down at me with those eyeless sockets. I needed its hand. I looked at the horde clawing at the gate. The metal was bending. I looked at the reactor, pulsing like a dying star. I looked at the commander on the ledge above. I had to go back into the swarm. The gate buckled. A hairline fracture appeared in the reinforced mesh, screaming as the steel yielded to the sheer kinetic force of the creatures slamming against it. I backed away, my boots sliding on the grated floor of the control platform. The red warning light of the console bathed everything in the color of old, dried blood, pulsing in time with the erratic thumping of my own heart. I looked at the console, then back at the gate, and finally up at the ledge where the commander stood. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was pacing. The movement was rigid, militaristic, a grotesque parody of the discipline it had possessed in life. The uniform was shredded, revealing gray, necrotic skin that had fused with the ballistic nylon of its vest. But it was the face that froze the marrow in my bones. It was missing the lower jaw, the tongue lolling out like a black eel, yet its eyes, milky, cataracts-ridden, seemed locked onto me with an intelligence that defied the infection. It knew I needed it. It knew it held the key. Protocol Black. I wheezed, the air inside my helmet tasting of recycled copper and fear. My suit's integrity alarm was a low, constant drone in my ear, a flatline sound indicating that the radiation was seeping in. My skin felt like it was suffering a sunburn beneath the layers of Kevlar and rubber. The violet light from the reactor pit below was intensifying, shifting into a blinding ultraviolet that I could feel in my teeth. I couldn't stay here. The gate would hold for another 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then the swarm, those sleek, pale abominations birthed from the amniotic sacs, would pour in and tear me into pieces small enough to fit through the grating. I had to go back out there. I had to climb the wreckage, drag that commander down to hell with me, and cut off its hand. I gripped the wrench. My knuckles were white, the heavy steel tool feeling pathetically inadequate against biological weapons engineered by the Department of Defense. That's what they were. I saw it now, in the way they moved. The Guardians weren't random mutations. As the one nearest the gate shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, I saw the surgical scars along its spine. I saw the ports drilled into the base of its skull. Protocol Black wasn't a containment failure. It was a weapons program. They had been trying to weaponize the undead, to turn the hunger into a guided missile. And down here, in the dark and the heat, the weapon had woken up. I didn't open the gate. I kicked it. I timed it with the impact of the creatures on the other side. As the mesh bowed inward, I lashed out with my boot, knocking the locking pin loose. The gate swung outward, catching the lead guardian in the chest. It stumbled back, losing its footing on the slick piping, and fell silently into the abyss below. I didn't wait to see it hit the water. I sprinted. I ran along the conduit, the heat from the pipes searing through my boot soles. The swarm reacted instantly. They didn't roar, they hissed, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a steam valve rupturing. I swung the wrench in a wide arc, catching a lunging creature in the temple. The impact vibrated up my arm, jarring my shoulder, but the thing went down, twitching. I wasn't running away from them. I was running toward the collapse. The gantry that had fallen from level 11 formed a twisted ramp of jagged steel and concrete, leading up to the ledge where the commander waited. It was a suicide run. I had to scramble up a 40-degree incline of unstable debris while an army of supersoldiers tried to eat my legs. I hit the base of the debris pile and started climbing. My breath came in ragged gasps. The air scrubber was failing. I was breathing in my own carbon dioxide now. Black spots danced in my vision, mixing with the violet radiation glare. A hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down. One of the Guardians had crawled out from under a collapsed ventilation duct. Its skin was translucent, veins pumping black sludge visible beneath the surface. It yanked hard. I slammed my face into the concrete slab I was holding, tasting blood. I kicked backward, my heel connecting with something soft and wet. The grip loosened. I scrambled higher, my fingernails tearing inside my gloves. I reached the ledge. The commander was waiting. Up close, the horror was high definition. The rank insignia on its collar was General, not Commander. The name tag read Sterling. This was the man who had signed the orders. This was the man who had buried this facility. It didn't lunge. It swiped, a backhand blow with the force of a hydraulic press. I ducked, the air whistling over my helmet as its fist smashed into the concrete wall behind me, pulverizing the masonry. I scrambled back, pulling the pistol from my holster. One round. One single, solitary round. I couldn't kill it. A headshot wouldn't matter if I couldn't get the body down to the scanner. I needed gravity to do the work. The general stepped toward me, raising both fists. Behind it, the ledge was supported by a single, stress-fractured I-beam, glowing cherry red from the reactor heat. "Sorry, sir," I whispered. Discharge papers came through. I aimed not at the zombie, but at the bolt anchoring the beam to the wall. I squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked. The deafening crack was swallowed instantly by the roar of the reactor. The bullet struck the superheated bolt. Physics took over. The tension in the beam was too great. The metal sheared. The entire section of the ledge groaned, tipped, and gave way. The general didn't scream. It just flailed, gravity claiming its prize as the floor dropped out from under it. We fell together. I slammed into a lower pipe, the wind knocked out of me so hard I thought my chest had collapsed. I barely managed to hook my arm around a valve wheel to stop my descent. Below me, the general hit the engineering deck with a wet crunch, landing just 10 feet from the override console. I dropped down, landing in a crouch. Pain exploded in my left knee. My suit was torn at the thigh now, and the radiation alarm had gone from a drone to a scream. Warning. Dose limit exceeded. I limped toward the general. It was broken, spine severed, but still thrashing. Its arms clawed at the metal grating, trying to drag its paralyzed torso toward me. The swarm was regrouping on the pipes above, preparing to drop. I had seconds. I knelt beside the general. The biometric scanner was 10 feet away. The corpse was too heavy to drag. I looked at its right hand, the hand that had authorized Protocol Black. "I need to borrow this," I gritted out. I raised the wrench. I didn't let myself think about the anatomy. I didn't think about the humanity. I thought about the air. I thought about the sky. I brought the heavy steel tool down on the wrist, again and again, hacking through bone and tendon until the prize came free. I grabbed the severed hand. It was cold, the fingers locked in a rigor mortis claw. I turned to the console. The first Guardian landed between me and the machine. It rose to its full height, 7 feet of pale muscle and malice. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle teeth, and shrieked. I didn't have a weapon. I had a severed hand and a failing will to live. "Get out of my way!" I screamed, primal and raw. I didn't fight it. I threw myself at it, shoulder-checking the creature with the last ounce of momentum I possessed. It was like running into a brick wall, but the surprise caught it off guard. We tumbled together onto the grating. I scrambled over its thrashing body, kicking it in the face, and threw myself at the console. I slapped the general's dead hand onto the glass plate of the scanner. The red light swept over the gray dead skin. Processing. A claw raked down my back, shredding the life support pack. The hiss of escaping air was the loudest sound in the world. I fell against the console, my vision tunneling. Identity confirmed, General Sterling. Access granted. Initiating Protocol Black, purge sequence. I expected water. I expected foam. Instead, the vents in the floor opened. Fire. Jets of liquid incinerator fuel sprayed into the pit from the upper levels. The purge wasn't a shutdown. It was a sterilization. The military didn't want to save the facility. They wanted to erase the mistake. The guardians screamed as the fire rain touched them. The sound was horrific, a chorus of the damned being unmade. The heat spiked instantly. My suit began to melt against my skin. I saw the service hatch, the waste disposal chute I had noted on the schematics. It was my only chance. It flushed directly into the mountain's underground aquifer. I scrambled toward the hatch, the flames licking at my boots. The general's body was already burning, the evidence of his crimes turning to ash. I grabbed the wheel of the hatch. It was hot, searing my gloves. I spun it. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized steam. I looked back one last time. The reactor vessel was cracking. The violet light was being consumed by the orange inferno of the purge. The swarm was burning, their silhouettes dancing in the flames like paper dolls. I dove into the dark. The slide was steep, slick with slime and algae. I tumbled through the dark, banging against the metal sides, spinning, falling until I hit the water. The shock of the cold was instant. It froze the air in my lungs. The current grabbed me, violent and heavy, dragging me under. I tumbled through the subterranean river, fighting the weight of my ruined suit, fighting the darkness. I saw light ahead, not violet, not orange, but the pale, gray light of day. I burst from the mountainside, spewed out of a drainage pipe into the basin of a waterfall. I gasped, inhaling real air, cold, clean, beautiful air. I dragged myself onto the rocky bank, collapsing into the mud. I lay there for a long time, listening to the mountain rumble deep beneath me. A muffled boom echoed through the valley. A plume of black smoke rose from the peaks miles above, marking the grave of the hive. I rolled onto my back, staring at the gray Virginia sky. I pulled the data drive from my pocket, the one I had snatched from the console in that final second. Protocol Black. The blueprints. The locations of the other 6 sites. The military hadn't fallen. They were hiding. They were farming these things. And I was the only one who knew where. I sat up, wincing as the fresh air stung my radiation burns. I checked my wrist. The Geiger counter was clicking slowly, fading. I was sick, battered, and alone in a world that wanted me dead. But I was breathing. I stood up, swaying slightly. I looked at the smoke rising from the mountain, then turned my back on it. The quarantine was broken. But the war. The war was just beginning.